Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the first panel of our Electoral Integrity Project and Carter Center annual virtual workshop. This is sponsored by the EIP, Electoral Integrity Project, which is an academic research project hosted here in Canada at RMC, the Royal Military College, and the Queen's University, and hosted over in the UK at the University of East Anglia. My name is Holly Ann Garnett. I am one of the two co-conveners or co-chairs of the Electoral Integrity Project, along with Toby James, who's over at the University of East Anglia. Today, we also are pleased to be sponsoring this with the Carter Center. And so our third co-chair, co-convener for this workshop today. And the rest of the week will be Anthony DiMatti, who's from the Carter Center. So thank you so much to our partners at the Carter Center for working so hard to pull this conference together with us. Our conference administrator is Halal Sert, who you've probably been emailing with, and Sophia Cal-Lam, who's our EIP project coordinator. So thank you to the two of them for pulling all of that together. So we did want to highlight one recent publication happening that was just published with the EIP. And so I'll pass that over to my co-chair of the Electoral Integrity Project, Toby James, who will share a little bit about that publication.
Yeah, thanks, Holly, and thank you everyone who's made this week possible. I think, as Pippa used to say, it really does take a village to make these things happen. So really are very, very grateful to everyone. And yes, we are delighted to announce that we just dropped a new Electoral Integrity Project book out with Cambridge University Press. It's called What is Electoral Integrity? Conceptualizing Election Quality in the Age of Complexity. And the book sets out, I guess, our vision of what electoral integrity is. Elections which meet four democratic principles and also empower the everyday citizen. It goes on to argue that there's major societal megatrends, which means that running elections is much more difficult. And we're now in an age of complexity where there are new threats emerging. The key thing is that it's free to download until the 14th of July. So I'll put a link in the chat in a moment. And as I say, it's completely free to download until then. And it's a book that we'll be using a lot in the work that the project produces over the next few years. So please do have a look when you get a chance.
Great. Thank you, Toby. And so he'll be putting that link in the chat that you can look at for the next couple weeks. Okay, so we're going to get started with our first panel. So I'll be chairing it. And so maybe you can start the recording for our EIP tech friends. And our first panel is Electoral Integrity at the Polls. It is a jam-packed panel, which we're really excited about, with people from both practitioner organizations and scholars. So that's really exciting that we have this great combination. And our discussant is going to be our EIP friend, Mitchell Brown at Auburn University, who also does some fantastic work with election administrators in the US. So we're really excited to start that off. So I'll give everybody I'll let you know when it's 10 minutes. I might have to pipe in just since you can't always see the chat. But we're going to start with Mollie Cohen and Geoffrey Sheagley, who are coming from Purdue University and University of Georgia. And they're going to be sharing their paper on how awareness of poll watchers shapes beliefs about their impacts. So Mollie, you're welcome to take it away.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be with you all this morning to talk to you a little bit about a book project that's ongoing with my collaborator, Geoff Sheagley, at the University of Georgia. So it's not a secret, especially not in a crowd like this, that public confidence in elections matters. So there are many reasons that public confidence in elections is critical. Elections only hold power if elites and citizens buy into their results, and public distrust in elections is easily increasingly mobilized into anti-democracy action. Here in this slide, you can see some examples from recent electoral protests in Peru, Paraguay, and Brazil. This is a small sampling of recent events. Sorry, I'm going to try and get into full screen here. Great. And increasingly, trust in elections is unmoored from the actual quality of elections. So this figure comes from a recent special issue at POQ, Public Opinion Quarterly, by Nicholas Kerr and colleagues. On the x-axis here, you're seeing measures of sort of observable freedom and fairness in elections. From the Varieties of Democracy data set. And on the y-axis, you're seeing two different measures of trust in elections collected through the world values surveys. Now, if confidence in elections tracked the actual integrity of those contests, we would expect to see, a 45-degree line. We don't see that. We just sort of see a lot of noise. Okay. So governments also want to improve citizen confidence in elections for exactly this reason. So there are a couple of ways many ways that governments go about doing this. We sort of view them as falling generally into two buckets. So the first increases barriers to citizens' access to the franchise, focusing on, for preventing false positives in access to the franchise. So that's things like stricter voter identification laws, limiting access at the polls, sort of things like same-day registration, vote by mail, early voting, and so on. A second bucket, of initiatives that governments take to improve citizen confidence in elections focus on transparency. So providing credible evidence that the government has nothing to hide from the citizens. So we think about things like post-election audits, election recounts, and also opening the doors to international and domestic observers as falling into this bucket, which is where this project focuses. So in particular, we're focused on one specific transparency initiative, which is partisan poll watching. So international election observation, nonpartisan election observation, has received significant attention from political scientists. There's a whole other panel on it later today, I believe. So we know a lot about observation. It decreases or displaces fraud sometimes. It can increase citizen confidence in elections sometimes under some circumstances. But we argue that partisan poll watching differs in some important ways. So first, partisan poll watchers are the lone explicitly partisan features of American polling places. From time to time, poll workers are partisan. They're nominated by the political parties, but their job is explicitly nonpartisan. They are not at the polls to fight for the preferences of their political team. Partisan poll watchers are. And as a result, we expect that known partisan biases, things like motivated reasoning and cheerleading, likely operate among the citizenry when poll watchers are present. At the same time, unlike nonpartisan election observers, poll watchers can raise issues during elections themselves. They can interrupt voters on their way to the polls and challenge their registration. And they can also raise issues with poll workers, which can make elections less efficient, make voters less happy, and also limit their access. Finally, poll watchers gather evidence from the polls, which can be used later by parties for malign purposes. This evidence can actually be used to undermine citizen confidence in elections down the road, a thing that we see increasingly around the world. Okay, so as I hinted at the beginning, this is part of a larger book manuscript that's pretty much done at this point. I'm going to be presenting you a little bit of evidence from chapter 3 today. So I've mentioned that we expect that partisan poll watchers will shape Americans' trust in elections, but there's an implicit assumption behind this argument, and that is that the American public will know what poll watchers are. And it turns out we don't have a lot of data about whether Americans know what poll watchers are. So before we can argue about their causal effects, we wanted to sort of get this baseline assessment of, do Americans even know who these actors are, what they do? So I'm going to show you 3 pieces of evidence today suggesting that they do. So first, about half of Americans know what poll watchers are. Interest in politics are the strongest predictors of knowledge of poll watchers. And we don't see a lot of sort of partisan polarization in affect towards poll watchers among those who do not have knowledge about them. I'm going to try and get through this quickly because I know I'm on a time limit. So First, these are survey data from a nationally representative draw from those congressional election studies, cooperative election studies, excuse me, in 2022 and 2024. We asked people straightforwardly, thinking about American elections, do you know what a poll watcher is? These are the shares of respondents in 2022 and 2024 who said yes to that question. In both years, we see well over 40% said yes. In 2022, it was 50%, and in 2024, it was 46% of people said yes. Just under 20% were not sure, and about 35% said no. Okay, so some Americans know what a poll watcher is. You might be wondering, well, like, how much is that? We compared these rates, excuse me, in to other political knowledge questions asked on these same batteries, and sort of rates of knowledge of poll watchers are pretty similar to levels of knowledge of, who controls Congress in the United States. So it's not as high as, knowing who the president is, but compared to other commonly used measures of political sophistication, poll watcher awareness is pretty similar. That question doesn't actually measure correct knowledge about poll watchers. So we're only asking people if they think they know what they are. So in one of those surveys, I believe 2024, we included an open-ended item asking people to define poll watchers in text. So we then went through, we read their answers, and we coded their responses as correct, incorrect, or kind of correct. So correct answers included things like observers watch the process to make sure that the rules are followed. Approximately correct answers were sort of harder to verify, and incorrect answers were just wrong. You can think about these as sort of an undergraduate level of response, maybe a ChatGPT level of response, things like poll watchers watch the polls. So in that survey, about 55% of respondents provided a correct answer. And I will note that something like 78% of those who said that they knew what a poll watcher was provided a correct answer. So it's a pretty good proxy for actual knowledge. Okay. Second, predictors of political information, so news attention, for example, predict knowledge more than do demographic factors. These are very busy figures. I don't want you to spend too much time getting caught up in them. They're OLS figures showing the association between each of the independent variables listed on the y-axis and self-reported knowledge of poll watchers. I just want to draw your attention to these coefficients. So what you're seeing here is the increasing likelihood that a respondent reports knowing what a poll watcher is at different levels of news attention and of education. So the increase as you go from a high school to a postgraduate education is about 40 percentage points in the likelihood of knowing what a poll watcher is. And for news attention, when we go for, increase from no news attention, it's very early where I am, I apologize, to a lot of news attention, we see an increase of over 60 percentage points in knowing what a poll watcher is. So these are the real drivers here of knowledge. We see much less movement in these other sort of demographic features. So different partisan groups are no more or less likely, for example, to know what poll watchers are. Okay. We asked a series of questions about Americans' attitudes towards poll watchers. So whether they agree or disagree that partisan poll watchers ensure that election officials do their jobs, that they follow the rules, that party officials follow the rules, that these partisan actors enforce the rules, or that they intimidate voters. All of these questions are on a 1 to 5 disagree to agree scale. And I'm showing you data from 2022 and 2024. So don't worry too much about the variations you're seeing here. But for these 4 sort of first positive evaluations, we see that most Americans are above the midpoint, the theoretical midpoint. So they tend to agree that poll watchers ensure that voters follow the rules, that poll workers do their jobs, and so on. And they tend to disagree or have no strong opinion that these actors intimidate voters. However, we find that those views of poll watchers are polarized among high knowledge participants, so not among low knowledge participants. This figure is showing the predicted mean in those outcomes. So outcome 1 here is those first 4 items, the positive one, we've turned them into a scale. And outcome 2 is the intimidation measure. The dark black circle are responses for Democrats, the gray squares are independents, and the gray triangles, lighter gray triangles, are Republicans. The top row here are people who gave an incorrect response to our question about poll watchers, and the bottom row are those who gave a correct response among poll watchers. So we don't see any differences among those who provided an incorrect response, but I do want to draw your attention to those who gave correct responses. So we see pretty big gaps here along partisan lines. So while Democrats and independents look pretty similar, Republicans are far more positive in their attitudes towards poll watchers than are members of those other groups on the first scale item. So that's a 0.6 gap, 0.6 unit gap. It's a little bit more than 60% of a standard deviation in the outcome.
Mollie, if you could start wrapping up, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yes, this is the very end. Thank you. And similarly, we see that Republicans are substantially less likely to agree that poll watchers intimidate voters. Okay, so to sum up, poll watchers play an important role in American elections, and we show that this precondition for having an effect on American confidence is met. The public does, in fact, know what they are. Thank you for your time.
Okay, perfect. Right on time there. I hadn't realized that you legitimately only had like 1 slide left. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mollie. We'll move right along to our second presenter, one of this year's actually EIP fellows, Martyna Hoffman from the Political Accountability Foundation. So Martyna, same thing. I'll let you kind of give you the warning at 10 minutes, give you a few minutes to finish up at that point. Thank you so much, Martyna.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Holly, thank you for introduction. As mentioned, I represent Political Accountability Foundation, and let me just thank all my coworkers who are here, who helped me put this research together. So, great thanks to all of you. So in many electoral systems, the selection of poll workers is largely based on nominations submitted by political parties or candidate nominating bodies. In Poland, these nominations play an especially important role. Individuals proposed by Komitety Wyborcze, which is this officially registered candidate nominating entities, are given priority over applicants without political affiliation. This arrangement is, among others, built on this assumption that having representatives of different political groups inside the polling station can create a mechanism of mutual oversight. Their presence is expected to reduce the risk of irregularities and strengthen the integrity of the process. It further assumes that poll workers see themselves as moderators acting on behalf of their political sponsors, so to say, and actively supervise the actions of other colleagues. In this study, I aim to assess how this mechanism works in practice by examining 2 conditions that seem necessary for this mechanism to function. There are several reasons why electoral systems rely on poll workers who are nominated by political parties or candidates. One common argument is that these poll workers are not neutral about the election outcome because they represent competing interests. They are expected to watch each other's actions, challenge irregularities, and this encourages misconduct. In this way, the system uses the conflict of interest between political actors as a safeguard for electoral integrity. But it is hard to know whether this assumption actually works in practice. And in my research using Poland as a case study, I examined the first step, whether the basic conditions for this mutual oversight based on conflict of interest is present. So at minimum, two conditions seem to be necessary. First, poll workers must know which party or candidate nominates them. Second, their own voting preferences should align at least somewhat within the political actor who nominated them. Without these conditions, the mechanism of mutual oversight rooted in this competing interests is unlikely to function as intended. So the study draws on data collected in cooperation with the Political Accountability Foundation. It is based on 1,600 self-administered questionnaires completed by poll workers during mandatory pre-election training sessions ahead of the 2025 Polish presidential elections. The survey was formed as part of a broader evaluation tool assessing the training process and was conducted across 68 trainings, locations in both urban and rural areas, covering nearly all of Polish administrative territories, województwa. This provides quite wide geographical coverage, although the specific locations were chosen based on where observer deployment was actually possible. It is also important to note that participation in the study was voluntarily, which introduces potential self-selection bias from our respondents. So this is something worth mentioning. And also another thing worth mentioning is there is sadly a lack of official demographic data on poll workers, which makes benchmarking kind of impossible and limits any assessments when it comes to representativeness of the data set that we gathered. For these reasons, the findings I will be presenting to you should be interpreted rather as exploratory than representative. So the research on the training component that I mentioned has already been published, and it's available on the Political Accountability Foundation website if you are interested in that. Just to start to briefly explain how poll workers are appointed in Poland, formally there are two paths for appointment for becoming a poll worker. The first path is through nominations submitted by candidates' party committees, the political entities that register and nominate candidates in election. The second path allows any voter to apply directly to the Electoral Commissioner, a regional election official. In practice, however, the core appointment mechanism relies on nominations from the first one, the candidate party committees. This is not official name. This is just a name to make this a little bit more approachable to you. Potential poll workers proposed through these channels are given priority, and selection process begins by allocating seats to ones submitted by political entities. Additional preference is given to nominees from committees formed by political parties or coalitions that previously won seats in earlier elections, and these poll workers are expected to make up at least 2/3 of the statutory composition of each polling station. Only once this pool is exhausted, candidates from other committees can be considered. The non-politically affiliated application path is used only when nominations from electoral committees are insufficient to fully staff a polling station. The final composition of polling station, maybe I'll just briefly make it smaller so you can see the whole screen, sorry. The final composition of polling station staffing reflects this appointment system, and according to data from the National Electoral Commission, around 90% of workers serving during 2025 elections were appointed through nominations submitted by candidate party committees, and that confirms that politically based nomination remains the dominant pathway. However, in our study, declarations of our respondents shows a different pattern. A much larger share of respondents reported entering the role through the non-political application path. This is most likely because in practice, many people are recruited informally through friends and family connected to political actors participating in election. And that affiliation, it's not always disclosed during the appointment process, leading to some believing that they are non-party affiliated. This interpretation is actually supported by a series of in-depth interviews we conducted back in 2020 when we were first starting to examine this issue. Some respondents in this study stated that they were nominated by entities other than the two legally recognized channels, even though such channels do not formally exist. Those are the answers marked on the chart as doesn't know. At the same time, several of them were able to link their appointment to a specific committee by mentioning a political party or a candidate's name or organization widely associated with one, but they weren't sure whether it was this party specific nomination. We interpret our findings cautiously when comparing them with national level data due to several methodological constraints I mentioned at the beginning, especially regional differences in how many poll workers are appointed through political versus non-political affiliated channels based on how active the political parties are in region. To address this, we use the city of Toruń as a control case study because it allows us to directly compare between official lower level records and our sample, which in Toruń covers approximately 33% of poll workers in all polling stations in the city. Official data shows that by the time of the training during which the study was conducted, only 28 individuals, which is about 2.6% of all appointed poll workers in the city, had been selected through the electoral commissioner, this non-political channel. In our survey, however, around 10.5% of Toruń respondents reported being nominated through this channel, a number that in absolute terms, in absolute numbers, exceeds the maximum possible number of such individuals according to the official data. In our survey, we also included a question on voting preferences of respondents. Within the group of candidate affiliate respondents, approximately 1/3 of them declared an intention to vote for the candidate nominating them. In contrast, about 1/4 indicated a different candidate, and further 30% of respondents stated that at the time of the survey, they had not yet made a final voting decision. So only 1/3 of our respondents wanted to remain, so to say, faithful to the committee that actually nominated them to become poll workers. Cases of mismatch between the appointing political actor and respondents' voting preferences should be interpreted with caution, as such differences do not necessarily mean a lack of loyalty or weak political identification. In some cases, it may reflect strategic voting, choosing a less preferred option in order to prevent a disliked candidate from winning. But at the same time, it can be assumed that individuals who identify with the nominating actor will, even when voting strategically, tend to shift their support toward options that are ideologically closer to them rather than toward politically distant candidate. So for this reason, the data was further analyzed by constructing a measure of ideological distance between the nominating committee and the candidate that our respondents intended to vote for, which were classified into 3 broad categories: left, center, and right. For each response, ideological distance was then calculated as the number of steps separating these categories on the left, center, and right. A value of 0 indicates, therefore, ideological alignment. For example, respondent nominated by a left-wing committee voting for a left-wing candidate. A value of 2 would indicate this maximal possible ideological distance. For example, person appointed by a left-wing candidate voting for right-wing candidate. The analysis conducted among those non-loyal respondents shows that almost 30% of them remained aligned with their political option, but at the same time, the majority of them, nearly half, wanted to vote for a candidate located 1 step away on this like right center left scale. And 16% placed their votes at the opposite end of the spectrum. So that's the situation where left-winged appointed candidate wanted to vote for the right. So let me just sum up my presentation by saying that the system for appointing poll workers in Poland is supposed to mean to balance political interest, to create mutual oversight, and give certain diversity based on that. Candidates nominated by candidate party committees are given priority with the goal of forming politically mixed polling stations and reducing the risk of irregularities by that. However, our studies suggest that, at least in case of Poland, this may not work exactly as intended, and some poll workers are not fully aware of how they are nominated, and even knowing their formal nomination, it does not always mean that they identify politically with the nominating actor or their political values. This raises questions about how balanced the interest inside the polling stations really are, although this study does not provide any evidence of wrongdoing. One possible explanation is that people have mixed motivations for becoming poll workers, including both financial and ideological reasons. In Poland, all poll workers receive the same compensation regardless on how they are appointed, because the politically affiliated nomination path is often more effective in securing a position. Even people without political identification may try to get recruited through that channel rather than through the supplementary non-political path, which is used only after the pool of politically nominated candidates is empty. These dynamics may look different in countries with other compensation systems. For example, in Hungary, party-appointed poll workers are not paid, so their participation might be relying mostly on political motivation. So that might be actually different. So what I've presented today is only one part of a broader data set that we're currently working on, and I'm currently analyzing additional data on actual motivations of poll workers we surveyed. So I hope to be able to share those findings with you soon. And so far, thank you for listening. I hope you'll get. I hope you'll have some questions, maybe helping us to develop this research further. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Martyna. Perfect. All right, so let's move right along to Daniel Hellmann from the Institute for Parliamentary Research. You're welcome to take it away, Daniel. You want to share your screen?
Thank you very, very much. Okay, thank you. So first of all, thank you for having me. My name is Daniel Hellmann. I'm a research associate at the Institute for Parliamentary Research in Berlin. And my main area of research is electoral management in Germany. And as some of you might know, a few years ago, one election in Germany, the Berlin 2021 election, went somewhat wrong, which is more or less uncommon in Germany. And hence, this will be the topic of this presentation. First, the paper was a quick idea of, wouldn't it be funny to compare a failed election to a nuclear disaster? And now it has grown into a paper, and I'm trying to make the best out of the framework I came up with. But before I talk about the 2021 election, I want to highlight under which perspective I'm really thinking about what went wrong back then. Because different from what most of electoral management literature focuses on in Germany and probably most established democracies, electoral manipulation is not really a big issue. Instead, as the Berlin case will show later on, electoral management errors or accidents are more common and probably equally likely to damage the overall perception of electoral integrity. But so far, research often focuses, as I said, on electoral manipulation, like with, for example, electoral forensics, or on strategies of how to strengthen EMBs. But I would argue preventing errors or major electoral accidents is one crucial and often overlooked part of the task of EMBs, because this can really damage the reputation of electoral management. So I tried to work out a framework of how to deal with failures in election management processes. And my main approach is via the normal accident theory by Charles Perrow. So on the left side, you see here the nuclear power plant 3 Mile Island. And on the right side, you see a picture taken during the Berlin 2021 election. And I want to show that both have, with some caveats, of course, some things in common. And I want to start with probably explaining what the normal accident theory actually is. And there we already see a few similarities or parallels. The normal accident theory was designed by Charles Perrow after he was part of the team that was investigating the 1979 3 Mile Island accident. For reference, this is the incident is listed as an INES 5 scale accident, so an accident with wider consequences, a nuclear accident with wider consequences. For comparison, the Chernobyl and Fukushima accidents that are probably better known are rated as INES 7, so major accidents, but nevertheless, this was the most impactful nuclear accident in the US, and it inspired Perrow to come up with the normal accident theory. The theory basically states that high-risk systems, high-risk technologies with specific traits that I will talk about later will inevitably lead to catastrophic outcomes. And for that purpose, he compares several different accidents, from the 3 Mile Island accident to aircraft disasters and drilling operations, and he finds several similarities and differences. And his main takeaway is that high-risk technologies should be avoided if possible. For our purpose, if we talk about elections, this is just not possible. We can't avoid elections just because we fear something could happen. But we can ask ourselves what we can learn from these accidents and how we can, strengthen the electoral management systems to avoid or mitigate errors better. And here the reformulation and reinterpretation done by Lacoste really helps. He identified 3 layers in Perrow's analysis: the cognitive, organizational, and the macro system. At the cognitive layer, errors can occur on an individual level, so biases, blind spots, lacks in training, and misconceptions can cause or enforce problems. Then second, at the managerial layer, resource scarcity in terms of money, personnel, time, technology can also cause organizational stress. And finally, at the macro level, Lacoste identifies several environmental determinants that reinforce either an error avoidant or an error affine world culture, like, for example, supervision by state actors, the existence of unions, poll watchers, like you talked about earlier, and in general, the integration into a wider net of accountability. And considering these aspects helps to avoid errors. But then a second step he does is what happens when errors occur, and how do you mitigate their effect? How do you manage crisis response? And for that purpose, Perrow differentiates between different technologies and who's responsible in an urgent crisis. He differentiates linear and complex interactions. Linear is when A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. And complex is when it gets, of course, a little bit more complicated, when there are feedback loops and circular interactions. So I would argue elections fall into that category here. They are more linear interactions. You have clear processes, clear steps of what you need to do in terms to organize the election. And second, Perrow has this idea of coupling. So either processes are tightly coupled, one follows the next nearly immediately, or they are loosely coupled. I try to visualize this here. And here I would argue, even if it's not comparable to the processes inside the nuclear power plant, elections, especially near the election day, are somewhat tightly coupled. There is not much wiggle room for errors, for delays. So I would argue that elections fall into this category of tight coupling and linear interactions. So in terms of crisis, as Perrow argues, there would be a centralized crisis response imperative. Here from his work himself, he listed several things that there are several enterprises and how he would list them along this scale. As you can see, most social enterprises like trade schools, junior college is listed down here in terms of loose coupling. I would argue that elections and election management themselves is a little bit more up there, but this probably is up for debate. But I generally argue that these analytical tools are first how to mitigate the effects of existing errors, or second of how to avoid errors, is an interesting framework to think about. and can be also applied to electoral management. So before I talk about how to apply this framework, I should probably say a few words on the Berlin elections that took place in 2021. It was a combined election of first federal, so Bundestag elections, state level elections, and regional elections, so 3 elections and 1 referendum. And this combination of elections, well, probably positive for the turnout, had its own drawbacks. Usually, ballots are brought to the polling stations beforehand by poll workers to ensure that enough ballots are there on election day. But even those special pulleys were bought to transport the ballots to the polling stations. Those were under-equipped on election day. Therefore, on that day, delivery trucks were sent to restock the polling stations, but there then was an additional problem, namely the Berlin Marathon, which blocked several paths to the polling stations and avoided them being refilled and restocked with voting materials. Additionally, there were not enough voting booths present, and as a consequence of all this, long queues formed and were the result. Some voters were not able to cast their votes after all. Others had to wait for hours even after the polling stations officially had to close and after the preliminary results were already publicly known. And then in the aftermath, the state and regional elections had to be rerun in 2023, and the federal election was rerun in 2024. So after all this, I just want to say a few things of how Perrow's framework applies here. So first of all, at the cognitive layer, the report of the Reform Commission that afterwards looked at this quote-unquote mess and tried to figure out what actually went wrong, pointed out a few things. For example, that the voting booth calculations were just wrong. They did calculations with the wrong assumptions, and therefore there were not enough voting booths. They did wrong calculations based on wrong numbers in terms of how to bring the ballot papers to the voting stations. And as a consequence of that, the poll workers, who often also received little training, were overwhelmed by the situation and reacted differently to the situation. So, for example, some closed the polling stations altogether, others printed ballot papers in nearby copy shops. And second, at the managerial layer, there was insecurity about funding until a few months before the election, and little to no staff for the returning officers who are actually in charge of running the election, coordinating the election. At the macro level, there was little public and international attention for the Berlin elections, so little accountability. And finally, as I already hinted to, in terms of crisis response, there was not really a centralized option for crisis response, since the state returning officer had no delegative power towards the other returning officers. So there was not really the option or even the attempt to mitigate the errors somewhat. So to come to the end of my presentation, some main takeaways. Those are more or less self-explanatory. I think we should focus more on how to avoid errors. That normal accident theory might be interesting for that. But my most important takeaway is that those accidents open up windows for windows of opportunities. So most of the issues pointed out were already addressed by the new management system, and there's now more personnel, more integration, and more cooperation, and more accountability to several agencies. And since then, for better or worse, the elections in Berlin are under way more scrutiny than before. And I would like to end the presentation on that note. And I'm really looking forward to your question. I hope I did not overstep my time by that much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And so we'll finish off this panel, our last presentation from Leontine Loeber from Vrije University, Amsterdam, and also a practitioner as well, puts on two different hats. So Leo, you're welcome to share your screen and get going, and I'll let you know when you're at the 10-minute mark.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. This is part of an ongoing project where we're working in the Netherlands, because when I started studying election fraud in the Netherlands in 2013, a lot of people said, well, do you actually have election fraud in the Netherlands? And even Dutch people were very surprised. And I think it fits in really nicely with the presentation about Germany that we see in more and more established democracies, that for a long time we thought we had everything done pretty good and electoral integrity was not an issue, and now more and more issues pop up. And in March of this year, we had municipal elections, and for the first time in almost 40 years, in one municipality, they decided to have a complete rerun of the elections because of problems with proxy voting. And the question is that those issues actually had such an impact on the outcome of the election that they had to rerun the election. So I thought for this conference, where we talk about the different aspects of elections and the debate between making elections accessible for voters, even voters who cannot be in the polling station on election day, versus the issue of how do you make integer elections and how do you prevent fraud. Proxy voting in the Netherlands is the next case study. Can you see my next screen like this? Or yeah. So in the Netherlands, proxy voting is not a new issue. It was introduced in 1928. We have traditionally a lot of water, so we have traditionally a lot of fishermen and sailors. They could not be in the polling station on the day of elections. The parliament debated between giving them proxy voting or mail voting. But if you are on a boat in the middle of the North Sea fishing, then mail voting is also not really an option. So they decided to go for proxy voting. In my PhD thesis, I call this a critical juncture. I think you see that quite a lot in elections, and especially elections in countries that have been doing it for a very long time. There are these different moments in time where Parliament decides on introducing a certain form of voting. And then once that's introduced, it's really hard to get back to the question if there are better options, because by that time everybody's used to it. Everybody thinks this is the way we've done it. So this is one of those major critical junctions, I think, in the Netherlands, where for people who cannot be in the polling station on the day of elections, proxy voting became the norm instead of mail voting, as happens in other countries. It's also good to note that in 1928 in the Netherlands there was a duty to vote, so voters had to vote. So you couldn't just say, "Well, you cannot vote." Too bad. So the Parliament also felt pressure to give these people an option to vote. They introduced a system of proxy voting. Has been changed a little bit over time, but I think the current system is still pretty much the same as it used to be. Voters get a voter card, and you have two options. You can give a written proxy vote. You send in your voter card to the municipality and you say, I want to give this person the proxy vote, and then he receives a special voter card, which is the proxy vote. But you can also give, and I was looking for an English translation of the word, but I couldn't find it, an onderhandse proxy vote, which means you do not have to use any governmental agency to give this proxy vote. You just sign the back of your voter card where it says, this is now a proxy vote. And then the person that you authorize also signs it, and then it becomes a proxy vote. The first one, the written proxy vote, you cannot withdraw. So if you've asked to do that, then you cannot change your mind and go into the polling station yourself on election day. If you do an onderhandse proxy, you can take your own voter card with the signatures and go into the polling station and say, I've changed my mind, I'm here anyway. So this is the most used form for people using proxy votes. Usually you give it to a spouse or a neighbor or somebody else. A couple of years ago, we did introduce the necessity to have a copy of the ID of the person giving you the proxy vote, due to stories about people fishing these voter cards out of mailboxes in student housing and then saying, oh, I got a proxy vote from somebody. So now you have to have a copy of the ID of the person that gives you the proxy vote. That can be a paper copy, but a picture on your phone or your iPad is also enough. So you just have to show that the person who gave you the proxy vote actually gave you access to their ID, doing a little bit of a check that you actually know the person. And then you have to, if they've been given a proxy vote, you have to cast that vote during your own casting of the vote, and you can only cast 2 proxy votes. So you cannot come in with 20 proxy votes or come in different times with proxy votes in different polling stations. So what's the problem with proxy voting in the Netherlands? Well, there's always been rumors of fraud. Like I said, there's been stories about people phishing the voter cards out of mailboxes, people not knowing that they get their voter card was given away because we don't have a registration system for voters. It's linked to the general registration of everybody living in the Netherlands. So if you're eligible to vote, you get a voter card, even if you're not interested in voting. And that also makes the system pretty nice for people who know people who are not really interested in voting. Because if people know, oh, she's not going to vote, I'm very easily approachable to say, oh, we know you're not going to vote. Are you willing to give me your proxy vote? So there's been stories of people selling proxy votes for a couple of euros because they say, I'm not going to vote anyway. So if somebody wants my proxy vote, then that's fine with me. That is illegal, but it's hard to prove because both the person approaching you to sell your proxy vote and the voter who sells their proxy vote are punishable by law. So it's really hard for the police to investigate people because if I admit that I sold my proxy vote, I'm also punishable. So the legislator has, over the years, done several things to try to combat the problems with proxy voting. A new law just came into effect on January 1st of this year, increasing the sentences for proxy vote fraud. Like I said, both the voter and the receiver are punishable, and it's now clearer in the language what proxy fraud is, because in the past the language was a bit hard to read, and it's now very clear in the law that giving the proxy vote always has to be initiated by the voter who's not going to be able to vote, and even asking somebody, oh, are you willing to give me your vote card as a proxy is now punishable by law. But then what happened during the municipal elections of March 2026? There was a municipality, Gorkum, where there's always been stories about problems with proxy voting. You see on the picture a Dutch news headline saying there's already been fraud for 30 years, but this time it was really easy they were really eager to pick up the voting card. There were many rumors of proxy vote during the election, and in one polling station, one of the candidates who was actually on the candidate list kept showing up with different voters who all had proxy votes, and all these proxy votes were prepared in the same way. So the setup of the proxy votes was the proxy vote, a paper clip, and an ID card, and all in sets of 2. And then it was pretty suspicious that the same candidate would show up with voters for his party who all had these sets of very neatly prepared 2x2 proxy cards. So the mayor got suspiciously involved with police, and last week, 6 people were actually arrested in regards to this fraud case. However, the problem in the Netherlands is the old municipal representatives have to authorize the outcome of the elections, and they have to do so usually 8 to 10 days after the elections were being held. So these rumors were going on, but there was no clear investigation yet. Police said, well, we're investigating, but we don't know what's going on. And they had to decide if these rumors were strong enough to rerun the election. It led to a pretty hectic debate. In the end, out of the 25 councillors, 13 voted for a rerun and 12 voted against. So it was a very narrow margin as well. But they did rerun the election. That has to be done within 30 days after the first election. So they had a second election. Turnout was a little bit lower because the second election had to take place during a public holiday because of the 30-day limit. But the outcome didn't really change. So it's still not clear if there was actual fraud during the first election, and also if that fraud actually influenced voters to vote differently, because in the second election, the seats really didn't shift from one party to another. So some of the problems with the current rules is that voters do not have to give a reason why they give a proxy vote. So it's not some countries in the world have an excuse proxy vote where you have to maybe show a doctor's note or so prove that you are away on holiday. But in the Netherlands, anybody can give a proxy vote even during the day of the election. So that makes it very easy to target voters. The use is skewed in very different municipalities. And if you map the municipalities with a very high level of proxy voting towards the religious communities that live in those municipalities, there's a strong correlation. It's really hard to prove, but there is a population of female voters that give proxy votes. So there's always the suspicion of that this instrument is also used in certain communities to suppress female voters from voting. And that's also, it's used more in certain communities than in others. So you see this in this map that there's areas where there's hardly any proxy voting, and then there's areas where there's quite a lot of proxy voting. If you would map this to religious communities, there's quite a bit of overlap. I'm being warned that I have to hurry up, so I'll hurry up. I looked at some alternatives for proxy voting that also allow voters to participate in elections if they cannot be there on the same day. Integrity is, I think, with proxy voting is the biggest problem because you don't have voter secrecy, and it's also very easy to pressure somebody. That's less with early voting or maybe a mobile ballot box that comes to the voters. But then the timing of the proxy vote, especially with the underhand voting, is very easy because if you get sick on the day of elections, you can still use proxy voting, whereas mail voting, you're already too late. And then it's the effort that the EMB has to put in to get voters to vote is less difficult than proxy voting than if you have, for example, a mobile box that has to be brought by the EMB to all the voters. So I don't think there's a bulletproof alternative to proxy voting that we could use in the Netherlands to target the same kind of voters. There are a couple of solutions. You could restrict the use of proxy voting to voters that have a legal reason not to vote, but then that also requires quite a lot of information and a lot of checking and a lot of privacy issues. You could reduce the number of proxy votes per voter to 1 to make it less easy to cast a large number of proxy votes by a small group of voters. And maybe the best solution would be to limit the proxy vote to the written proxy vote only, and not use the on-the-hand voting, proxy voting, where there's really no control by the government on who is doing this and why. And then I'll wrap up and give it over to you, Holly.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Leo. Okay, let's turn it over to Mitchell Brown from Auburn University, who will have maybe a few quick comments for the presenters. I'll let you give a few comments. Thank you so much for doing this for us.
Okay, yeah, I'll try and be fast because we do have 5 full papers. And by way of introduction, I'm Mitchell Brown. As Holly said, I direct the Institute for Election Administration Research and Practice, which is a collaboration between Auburn University and the National Association of Election Officials in the U.S. We do training and observation and research and publish a praxis journal on election administration, which Holly has published in. So happy to be here. Impressive groups of papers, really similar and different at the same time. I'm going to go in the order that they were presented, and for the sake of time, I'll be sort of top level, but happy to have offline conversations with the authors. I'll start with the Cohen and Sheagley paper. I really look forward to reading this book. The second I got it, I was like, all right, this is a chapter in a book. Because I'm super curious to find out if there was any actual impact on trust from the knowledge and understanding of election observers. I just note that I've observed elections in the U.S. all over the United States for the last 15 years. And one of the things that I think is interesting and might be important in your modeling is that the culture around poll watching varies by both the geopolitical context in the US and the rules and the political environment. And I was wondering if you were able to control for states that require bipartisan election officials, and what that looked like. Your finding about the Republicans actually doesn't surprise me at all. In recent years, in the polling places I've been at, the amount of organizing and training about poll watching on the part of the Republican Party across the country is significantly higher and much more professional than the Democrats. And so I was like, yeah, right on. Like, I totally believe it. So anyway, look forward to your book. On the Hoffman paper about poll worker nominations in Poland, and giving people finding that giving that there's this not alignment between party and the folks there. That was really interesting. I teach some comparative election administration classes, but most of my everything I do is U.S. focused. In the United States, in some states, poll workers are required to be aligned with the party for the exact reasons that you talk about, why we should have them. But in most of those places, um, there there's usually an imbalance, and so they have to do something else. And so we have a couple of places in the country where the poll workers can essentially represent another party for that election day and for the functions of representing or for that election day because of this. And my general sense is that if our goal in having poll workers work at the polls is neutral administration, then what you found in the polling context is actually positive and not problematic in any kind of a way. If our motivation is, general participation, or if the motivation of the poll workers who are essentially switching parties or unaware that they're representing a different party, is, if their personal motivation is, I just want to be involved in a democratic process or I want extra money, then I think their participation would support more neutral administration. And so the real interesting question that I think that would raise is whether it translates into, for the people who are aware that they're there representing a party versus not, whether it translates into different quality of their work as a poll worker as opposed to anything else. And that'd be something that I think would be super interesting to look at. And just flying through these. On the Hellmann paper, I loved reading this paper. We train election officials, and we've been doing this for 35 years across the country. And one of our basic classes that we do training on is about how systems and complex systems work. And we do a class on contingency planning, and we use Perrow's book and this theory of normal accidents in both of these classes. And so to the extent that you're looking for any publications or literature tying election administration to Perrow's idea of normal accidents, my colleagues Robert Montjoy and Kathleen Hale I think they've written about these things, and you might look at this. I think it's super important to tie these ideas to eroding public trust and contingency planning, right? There's a piece of this that I think is about the professionalization of the field and of EMBs at the local level, or election offices is what I would call them at the local level. And I do think there's a great tie-in to integrity questions because without high professionalization and professionalism, then what you have are practices that are more open to the possibility of undetected manipulation as opposed to normal accidents. And sorting out the difference between the two of them is pretty important. I would say that I think context again really matters here. The idea that elections are linear versus complex depends on a lot of factors. One of these is the extent to which EMBs rely on different vendors to do various parts of the electoral process. Or in information sharing. I would say that in the US, we have at least one state where at every local county level, and it's the county level that would run the offices, there are 5 different government offices in running the elections, plus vendors, plus the state. And until a court ruling that happened here in 2013 called Shelby v. Holder, the U.S. Department of Justice. And I think the complexity that comes from something like a system that's arranged like that makes election administration complex and not linear. And so the context of which types of elections you're talking about. But the idea of tight coupling, especially right in front of an election, 100%, and explains a lot of the problems that we see. I will say as a side note, I feel like the US system gets dunked on in the international community all the time. And I've seen all kinds of terrible things happen in election offices. And what you described in Berlin, I can't imagine ever happening. And I thought that was really interesting. But again, completely agree. These kinds of accidents can also lead to important reforms. And so I think this might be also a really interesting study in the Berlin case study example of election administration and policy windows, and using that. Finally, then, because I know I'm like about out of time, Holly, the Van Leontine paper. I have read about proxy voting before, and I actually love it. There are a couple of places in the US where there's a lot of unintentional voter fraud by well-meaning parents. One of them that I think of off the top of my head is if you talk to state election officials in the state of Utah, where there's a lot of LDS, they get a number of election fraud cases because of well-meaning what they refer to as missionary moms, and their kids are doing missionaries in places where they can't get an absentee ballot for some reason. And so the moms are like, I know how my child wants to vote. They love voting. This is important. And they commit voter fraud. And so proxy balloting would like get rid of that. So I love the idea of proxy balloting. I'm sorry we don't do it. But I get it. Like I was reading, I was looking at your slides and I was like, oh, okay, you can see some real trends in where it's happening, and it does raise some questions about integrity. I wondered about in your alternatives if you don't list vote centers, and I don't know enough about the context of the Netherlands, whether you use vote centers or not. I think vote centers are one of the best things that's happened in the U.S. context for election administration, and would maybe consider reading and thinking about that. 2 other quick things. And I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, the Onderhanze. I think is the U.S. equivalent to an affidavit, which is signing an oath that what you're attesting to is true. And so that's just the word I think I would use. It's like an affidavit. And actually that's it. So thank you all. They were great papers. It's a fun way to start the day, or start my day and end some of your days. So I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Mitchell. That's great. So authors, I'm going to give each of you just like half a minute to respond to each of the questions.